Hi, everyone. How are you? Is everyone going to Google me later, like try and give me a research they want to know about and come up and see if I can?
That'll come during the coffee break, I'm sure.
Yes.
So, Kim, when I first said, let's talk about risk, you said, so much doom and gloom, but that was your first reaction. But of course, you want to talk about risk when it comes to resilience. Why is it important to do?
Well, you actually cannot talk about resiliency without first talking about risk. In fact, the definition of resiliency is success despite the risks against you, or overcoming the odds. So you really have to have risk in order to have resiliency first. Interestingly, to give you the history of the sort of notion of resiliency, it really started in the 1950s. Norman Garmsey, a professor in psychology at the University of Minnesota, was studying children of schizophrenic mothers and really trying to look at all the risk factors that happens when those kids grow up in those kinds of environments, and found that this group of kids, that despite having this, schizophrenic mothers with severe mental illness, schizophrenia, that they were seeming to be okay in school. They had good self-esteem, they were doing well academically, they had good peer groups, and sometimes researchers might say, that data don't make any sense, let's just get rid of it and ignore it. But in this case, Norman Garmsey then said, well, maybe those children can teach us something about what are those factors, what are those individual factors, contextual factors that actually promote their success despite having some risk factors.
So that really is like looking at the cup half full. What isn't broken here? What is working?
Right,
so
exactly.
Interesting. And one of the things that has happened over the years is I think this term, youth at risk, has become a term, and some young people have identified themselves as, I'm a youth at risk. So is there some risk at labeling people as being at risk?
Yeah, so first of all, it has to say at risk for what? So when we say they're at risk, is it at risk, commonly people talk about at risk for graduating high school, successful entry into the adult world, being able to have stable employment, being able to have good relationships. So we really need to think about that at-risk notion of at risk for what. However, I feel that the at-risk label, and not just myself but others, gets used too often. And it sometimes can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you use that term and designate the adolescent at risk, suddenly that becomes their identity instead of really thinking about what are their strengths. And so we have to be really cautious with the identification, like any kind of problem, instead of saying that's the person, instead of this is something, they might have some risk factors in their life, they might have contextual factors at home, in the community, poverty, things like that, but we have to not define the individual. And I just want to put some caution between using that at-risk label too frequently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that strikes me is in my own life is when things have happened to me and people assume they know how that bad experience landed for me. They think they know whether or not I'm at risk. So one of the things that you talk about, and actually many people talk about, is how can you really determine if a youth is at risk if you don't ask them, if you don't talk to them? So just talk for a minute about the importance of engaging young people themselves, even little children themselves, in the conversation about risk.
Well, we have to be cautious to, again, not assume that certain experiences are having a negative effect. Mm-hmm. And so I think the idea is to see how they understand that experience of, let's say, death of a parent, for instance, or have had some other experience, to really see how do they see it. Sometimes we think of, for example, children who who are in a divorced family, we'll automatically say they're at risk, when in fact that might have been, it actually might be something more positive in terms of that. The other thing, and I wanted to talk about, again, talking with children, is that we have to see, and resiliency is the same way, because we have to see risk and resiliency are kind of back and forth, kind of two sides, of the same coin, that, for example, it might be that a young person, from a developmental perspective, experiences death of a parent at 5. And everybody looks around that child, and their child seems to be doing well in school, they're doing well, and everybody said, oh, they're resilient, they're doing really well. But then what would happen, perhaps, is when that child reaches 12 or 13, where they now have new cognitive capacities to think about what would my life have been like if my parent had lived, and that could enter new risk factors that, with looking at depression and things like that. So we have to also see this idea of, understanding the child's perspective, but also what I would argue is taking a developmental perspective of understanding how children make sense of those factors in their environment.
Because we might say, but that happened a long time ago.
Right.
How could that be? It must be something else. And you're saying, but you only reach that point in your life where you make a different kind of meaning of the death.
Yeah, and actually a lot of adolescents with physical disabilities, like or hard of hearing or deaf, you see a lot of them who don't want to start wearing any assistance when they reach 12 or 13 because they don't want to be seen as different. So these new capacities in these developmental stages can enter new risks that might not have been present previously.
Well, one of the things that we're going to do here is we're actually going to look at some of the, I'm glad that you did the caveat about when you look at risk, think about these nuances about risk, think about the personal experience of risk. But there is some research about experiences that are more adverse, that can cause long-term problems. So can we go to that conversation?
In the 1990s, there's some researchers, Folletti and colleagues, who started looking at adverse childhood experiences. And they developed a series of questions. It actually started because they were doing some research through the Center for Disease Control, and actually they found out they were doing something about obesity and dieting, and they found that half of the people who were being successful, first of all, they found out they lapsed, and then when they started interviewing them to figure out what had happened, they actually found that a large proportion of them had had abuse during childhood. And so they started thinking about, is there something about these early experiences that actually have adult outcomes in terms of health? And so hence they did this larger study of about 17,000 adults that was a retrospective questionnaire to ask if these things actually happened during your life. And I think we have a slide for the, yes. So in the first study, they identified these 8 adverse childhood experiences and asked these individuals, 17,000, had you had any of these 3 types of childhood abuse, such as emotional abuse, physical abuse, or contact sexual abuse? And then they looked at other kinds of 5 exposures of household dysfunction: exposure to alcohol or other substances, things like mental illness present in the home, violent treatment of a mother or stepmother, criminal behavior, and parental separation. And what they found first was surprising, it surprised them, was that 64% of the sample had had at least one of these as a child. So 64%, only 1/3 had not experienced any of those. So that was, and 40% had experienced 2 or more. So then they started to think about, do these early experiences in childhood get under the skin? Do they actually have implications for adult health, adult well-being, adult things like mental health and things like that? So they started to look at, and I think the next slide looks at that, where they started to look at this idea of adverse childhood experiences that then lead to this social, emotional, cognitive impairment, that then attempt to adopt these health risk behaviors that are probably self-medication, ways to deal with these things, that then leads to disease and other social problems that leads to early death. And what they found was, in looking at those, if you had 4 of these adverse childhood experiences, you had multiple disease factors. You were more likely to smoke, have alcoholism, have mental health problems, have suicidal ideation. And if you had 6 of those experiences, your life expectancy was decreased by 20 years. So it really goes to say about these risk factors that happen really early on in development can have long-range outcomes for health and well-being. And anyways, it's a really critical study because I think it gives emphasis to the notion that what happens in childhood actually does have long-range effects for health and those influences. However, I have to go to the glass half full.
That's what I thought you were going to do. If you hadn't, I was going to.
Because we know that there's neuroplasticity, that we're malleable, and there is something, and I'll let Mike talk about this more, but this idea of resiliency of the human spirit, and this idea that, ordinary magic, as Anne Maston calls it, that it's much more likely to have these factors. So,
well, even as I look at that list, I see it also gives a list of clues around where you can have interventions along the way. This just really shows what a pathway would be if all doesn't go well, right?
Yeah, and you bring, that's an important point, this idea of, are there certain developmental transitional periods in which there's higher amount of risk that can have longer range outcomes? And we look at times of transitions as actually times in which there's heightened opportunity for risk.
So what kinds of transitions?
So, well, I know sort of early life, certainly before 5, we know is a huge factor in terms of having a consistent, a caring adult in their life, having consistency, support, feeling loved. Any transitions to school are another risk opportunity in terms of having to navigate new roles. Actually, one finding, I love this one study Gary Ladd did, where children who were entering kindergarten, those children who had at least one other child that they knew in that classroom, that they knew from the neighborhood or preschool or something, for just knowing that one person, were more likely to make more friends during the school year and have more positive attitudes towards school by the end of the year. So again, that transitional time, if you go in and you don't know anyone, what happens in terms of if you don't have the adequate coping sources. The other really important transitional time in development is early adolescence. There's actually no other time in the life cycle, except maybe the first year of life, where there's like a stress pileup, they actually call it. Well, I'd say between the ages about 10 to 14, where there's multiple influences in terms of cognitive changes, biological changes, neuroplasticity, the brain, peer relationships, friendships, certainly being part of a peer group, family relationships, as well as school transitions. And I often sort of wonder that it's such a joke of Mother Nature, that right at the time where you start to think about what other people might be thinking of you and have heightened self-consciousness is right at the time where you begin to smell, you begin to, your face breaks out, you have all those kinds of things. So again, those developmental transitions, and again, we have to look at those developmental transitional linked turning points, and actually the other one is transition to adulthood, is windows of opportunity. Yeah. Those are the opportune times to intervene and really have larger impact in promoting and in putting some off the course of risk.
And I think Mike Unger's going to talk more about that, and you're going to hear a lot more about that today, but I think it's worth repeating what you just said, that when someone is going into a period that you have a sense is going to be filled with risks, that is any kind of transition, to know that that's the time that is also ripe for opportunity to promote resilience. We'll hear more about how, but that changed my way of thinking when I saw one of my children, for example, going through a transition. Instead of just being worried about it, I was thinking, oh, there's something here that could get better for them, right? And so what do we do to make that happen is the question, right? So one of the other things about the risks is that there's a continuum. Did you mention that already? And what is the system, the Bronfenbrenner? Yeah, we'll bring that up next.
There's some going. There you go.
It's a little oval.
It's good. You have the whole thing. So when we look at risk, we have to look at multiple layers of influence, from the biological risk. The individual might bring sort of a sensitivity to context, which I'll talk about in a minute. They might have risk, individual personality characteristics. They might have a temperament that actually is slow to warm up, and it actually doesn't match the parent's temperament. So there's that context of the family, the peer group, the school, the community, and the larger society. And so even things like the socio-political ideologies of how we look at children and what kind of policies we have in place to support children, how they're viewed, is really an important thing. Even things like views such as something called the just world hypothesis. So the just world hypothesis, which is a very conservative way of thinking, whereas basically people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. So people are in poverty because they just haven't worked hard enough. Those kinds of ideologies influence risk, so we do have to look at those multiple layers. In schools, for example, I've argued in some ways schools can certainly be resiliency promoting, but they actually could be risk promoting as well.
How so?
Well, if you think about relationships, and I loved Linda's activity this morning, is how much does the structure of the school actually create these opportunities for I see you, I am here. You know, if you look at the high school, for instance, given many different classes, you know, teachers having so many different students, that they have little opportunity to forge those relationships, what we know are the engine that drives all of this. I think about a study we did several years ago downtown where we asked the students, high school students, we put them into different groups, those kids at risk for dropout, see we did the at-risk label, those kids averaged and then honor roll, and we asked them, what are 3 things that teachers do to show they care? And the number one reason across all those groups of kids was a teacher who says hello to me in the hallway by my name.
Wow.
You know, so this idea of I see you, you know, so if you don't have those opportunities in a large setting, large schools, large classrooms, you're creating risk. You are. And to me, it's particularly important because high school, those, again, a transitional period, are the times where you really need to heighten those opportunities for connection.
Then I wonder when I hear that about how the teachers and the educators themselves feel, is their resilience being promoted or cultivated? Who's saying I see you to them? Yes. I mean, it goes out and out. It's not.
Well, and I think that's what's so important when we look at the factors of who's caring for the adults. Yes. And the idea, are the children at risk? Because they're basically just the collateral damage of a system that isn't supporting the adults to care. So, you know, we know, for example, from some recent research we did that there's a stress contagion, that teachers with higher levels of stress and burnout actually have students who are in their classrooms with higher levels of morning cortisol, which is an index of stress for those kids. So that notion of the stress contagion and how that happens at home, are the children coming into the classrooms with higher stress because of the families and what's happening there, and are the teachers then being empathic and picking up all of that stress and catching it? Are the teachers having many different factors of influencing their stress, and they're coming in, it's a downstream of onto the children? And I would argue it's some combination of the two.
Yeah. We are in a situation in British Columbia right now of transition where we have a renewed curriculum that offers, I think, some opportunities for that, for those I see you moments. Would you agree?
Yeah, so British Columbia, some of you are teachers in British Columbia, I imagine. You know, we have this new, I keep on calling it new, but it's a redesign. I'll follow Maureen's lead here. The redesign of the curriculum. And the focus, we are the first jurisdiction in North America where we explicitly, intentionally, in the K-12 curriculum, have a focus on promoting personal and social competency. It's quite amazing. Yes, you should definitely. And this notion of an entire school system taking on the idea of promoting those factors that we know from the science. And I do want to emphasize that this redesign, I keep on saying new, redesign of the curriculum is actually based on the latest science. The research that behind the 3 competencies of communication, thinking, and social and personal competency are all informed from the latest science and research of what we know of how kids learn best.
Yeah. While we talk about different kinds of risks, the list that you showed earlier, we said earlier that each child themselves will come up against those risks as individuals. And one of the groups of children who we seem to think are most vulnerable are those children who are more sensitive. And there's more literature out there now about children who are sensitive. So what about that? Are those children the ones who are most likely not to succeed up against risk?
It's very interesting. Some research by Tom Boyce, who's a developmental pediatrician who spoke at the Heart Mind two times ago, coined the phrase, this biological sensitivity to context, and really finding that some, as I mentioned before, are wired to enter the world with much more heightened sensitivity. They pick up the things. So on the one hand, there's children, we call them dandelion children, who come into the world with not a heightened sense of biological sensitive to context, they come into the world kind of like ready to grow wherever they are. So they're the dandelion kids, they grow, they are able to really grow, and even if they're in a toxic, risky environment or that. So we call them, in some ways, resilient, they would. But then there's, on the next slide, there's orchid children. And these children come into the world with this heightened sensitivity to context. And if you put them in a toxic environment that's high stress, all sorts of problems, they will become the best of the worst. They actually soak it all in. However, if you put these children in a greenhouse, a loving, nurturing, child-centered, responsive environment, they grow like orchids and actually outperform the dandelion children on a number of different outcomes. So we really need to think, I don't know if any of you ever deal with any students who are frustrating? No. Maybe to reframe it and think about, maybe they're that orchid child. Maybe that's what I can do to help them, to nurture them, because then maybe I'll see what happens if I do these things.
Right, so that concept of being absorbent to what is around you. So if it is negative, that's what you absorb, but if it's positive, you absorb. And I remember Tom Boyce talking about that. He was very excited when he discovered that, because it meant that when we see these children who are very sensitive, maybe think of it more as a giftedness of being able to absorb, right? That then the adults need to create the environments where they're absorbing nurturing and caring and loving. Yeah. There's another idea, I think, that often comes up around risk, that this is about poverty only, that these are about children who are in, first of all, extreme adversity. And we do associate it with lower socioeconomic status. But there's research now that says that those are not the only children who are at risk.
Well, I think what we have to do is look at this flip. So you bring up a really important point. So sometimes a lot of our resources go to those in poverty, because of course that provides, because it's often associated with numerous other risk factors besides just low income. Often lone parent homes, all kinds of issues that emerge from having that poverty. However, we're also now finding that there's risk among the affluent, the psychological costs of material wealth, where researchers are now finding that those adolescents who come from more of those affluent families, that they actually have higher rates of depression and anxiety. That they actually, when you ask them, there was one study by Mike Csikszentmihalyi and colleagues who looked at happiness and socioeconomic status, and found that among those at the highest levels of affluence or socioeconomic status, they had the lowest levels of happiness. Whereas the children from the lower levels of, not in extreme poverty, but lower socioeconomic status, actually had the highest levels of happiness. And we talk about what are those psychological costs of material wealth, how a lot of these children are growing up in families where the parents are working so much to provide all these material things, but they're actually not present and not there. And I even think about the things like a loss of social capital. Social capital is how much your community kind of cares for you, and is how much the grocer knows your name, and you can go to the corner store and you know your neighbor and can go borrow a cup of sugar. As you get more affluent, what happens is that you become more removed. The driveways become longer. You're more set apart from others. So many of those factors that we know are protection in terms of feeling connected are then lost among these affluent youth.
It's so interesting because so much of what you're describing about the longer driveways is done in the name of love for children. We want our children to have everything. We want our children to be protected. So one of the questions that I have for you is, do we want to have our children avoid risk? Is this what should this be our intention? Risk is bad. I'm not going to have my kid experience any risk.
Well, so like I say, so many of you who know me know I have two boys, Griffin and Gray. I was trying to talk Gray into coming. He's 16 now. He didn't want to come today, but maybe another time.
Imagine not wanting to come.
He wanted to sleep
on his day off.
Yes, his day off. And Griffin, and as a parent, having them, I wanted to bubble wrap them. I wanted to get them in the plastic bubble because I hadn't realized that when I saw them in pain, it was the most painful thing for me to experience, beyond anything I'd experienced before. It was so difficult. However, the research really talks about this idea of an inoculation approach. This idea of if you actually buffer all the opportunities to deal with disappointment, risk, that you can in fact do a disservice to children, because then when a big factor happens, they have no resources from which to draw. So this idea of a sort of stealing effect of buffering with these, you know, I don't want to say extreme risk, but the idea that don't, you know, I think Paul Tough said, you know, the greatest path to success is failure, to really looking at things that don't work out for you and figuring out how to learn from the situation and move forward.
Yeah, with adult children, I discovered pretty quickly that I wasn't going to be able to solve all the problems, so I was just grateful if they were able to navigate that. And they had lots of practice. All right, so we're just about at the end of our conversation, but I just want us to turn that corner before we move on and have Michael Unger come up, because I know most of your research has been about answering the question, what can we do to mitigate some of the risks for children? So just to let you talk for a moment about, is it possible? Is that thing that you showed earlier where you go from risk to death? I mean, does that have to happen that way?
Well, you know, I am going to just start off. I mean, there's a couple of things that I really think about what I've learned over the last several decades about looking at risk, you know, and you know, and some of you have heard me speak before, know I worked as a teacher in an alternative high school for students at risk, and again, that at-risk label, who had been at risk for dropping out of high school and things, and how so much of what I learned when I started working there was, at first, they treated me horribly. They called me names, they sort of set me apart, and then I quickly learned that if I changed my reaction to them, that it actually changed their reaction to me. So I started really looking at them, pushing me away. I was the reading teacher, many of them had reading, that it was their resilience, that it was their protection against being vulnerable. And over the years, you know, one of the things that I really realized is how much my own background, experience, well-being influenced how I interacted with those children, with those adolescents, and how much I needed to really take care of myself. But also, it made me realize that, you know, I tried to think, because I learned so much from them. It really, I'm here today because of them, because they were my teachers. They really, I listened to them, I listened to what their needs were, but also, I really loved them, and I cared for them, and I realize now that, you know, it's interesting, you know, what led me to sort of look at risk. I started, it dawned on me just a few years ago, this is just so, I feel like so lame, is how much that I was able to deal with that situation was because of my own family background. And that self-awareness, so it just a little bit about my background. I come from a very, outside of Chicago. Do I have a Chicago accent still? A little bit. Been here for 25 years. But how I had grown up in a very working class family, the only one in my family to go to university. And I had a younger brother who dropped out of high school, 2 years younger, and I had been a real connection to him, but I knew his friends really well, and they used to come over to our house, and he dropped out at 15 and kind of got into some trouble and things like that, and how I then realized, you know, and I loved my brother and I had all of his friends, and that when I started working at that alternative high school, how I wasn't afraid of them. I saw them as my brother. Yeah. I saw them for, I saw their potential, and I was striving for that, but that it was really that self-awareness, that the important role of the adults and our perceptions and what we bring into the room, into our interactions, and how we're influenced by our past experiences, and how important it is to care for teachers. I just have to say, if I had one sort of emphasis, I have two things to really emphasize. First is to care for teachers, care for the adults. We need to, if we really want to promote resilience and mitigate the negative effects of risk, we have to surround the adults with that care and resilience. And I think the last thing I want to say, again, what I've learned over the years is how important it is to talk to the students, to talk to them, to figure out what are the things that will help them. Like how often, I remember going to the student, you know, like, what do teachers do to show they care? Is that novel to ask kids, what do they think teachers do to show they care? Yeah. You know, it is in some ways, yes, you know, but it shouldn't be. Or what do we want, how do we engage kids in the conversation of how do you want this classroom to be? How do you want us to be with one another? How do we create the conditions that are going to support your resiliency. And I think the last thing I want to say is, and I was thinking with the adverse child experiences, is that so many people have had some risk in their life. I'm sure many of you are probably here today because there's something that's drawn you to this concept of resilience. And what that makes me think is that when we approach someone who might be driving us a bit crazy, maybe a colleague, maybe a partner, maybe a child, that to really reframe it and think about them with compassion, because we don't know those risk factors that they've encountered, or we might know, and how they get they influence them. So if we sort of, instead of responding to that, if we sort of take that real compassionate lens, I think it will help us move forward to promoting resilience.
Well, thank you. Of course, you landed on compassion, and we appreciate that. Thank you so much for being here, and you're going to be here for the rest of the day.